Welcome to today's class in which we discuss the ethics of Shadchanim and other forms of brokerage. We will be taking a light dive into some of the rules and regulations and customs surrounding brokering deals. When I refer to brokering when it comes to halakha, it's not much different than what we mean in the colloquial local sense, that you actually have nothing to sell. You are not party to the thing. You are simply getting two people together to come to an agreement and a meeting of the minds. And we're going to talk a little bit about what ethics surround the deals, what are kind of good practices and good ideas to follow, and what is demanded of one via halakha. And I wanted to give recognition to the Yerucha program. We teach this in Silver Spring at my local shul. And the Yerucha program, they do a great job of putting together very interesting, pertinent topics. And they collect them in these wonderful booklets that allow someone like myself to teach the class with ease and with alacrity, because they get straight to the point and they get us through the sources. And I can't thank the creators and the contributors to Yerucha enough for the tremendous harabatzas Torah, the significant amount of spreading of the knowledge of Torah law they have contributed. And so I'd like to share some of that knowledge with all of you now with this shir. And the shir is given live now. It will be also recorded and shared from YouTube when it uploads. And so we'd like to begin now discussing some of the rules regarding hiring a broker or a shadchan to act on your behalf and to pay them a fee for their service. Let's talk about the different types of contracts one can enter when it comes to halakha. There are basically two types. The number one way in which people are compensated when they enter into an employment contract, and these are found most directly in Choshen Mishpat, the Shulchan Aruch Choshen Mishpat. They are in Siman in the section 331, and it goes all the way to 339, but basically 31, 32, 33. That's kind of where the nuts and bolts of employment contracts are discussed. How do you enter it? How do you break it? Who's responsible? That's sort of how it is. And a broker has one of two possible situations in which they can be under the employ of another. They could be someone who is assigned to do a task for a certain amount of time, which makes them similar to a day laborer, which means that they are paid for the effort they put into completing that task. The other possible situation is that a broker is expected to do a job or provide a specific service, and they are paid for when the service is completed. So those two types of employment contracts affect the way in which one compensates a brokered deal. Again, there's no final product by the broker. They're not really party to it. They're simply creating a meeting of the minds. So what's interesting is that the concept of brokerage in general, it really doesn't show up until after the Talmud. There are cases of where the Talmud discusses people who are not a party to something, but they provide a valuable service. Talmud talks about cases of, let's say, there's a flood and someone saves your stuff from the flood. Well, that's a benefit for you, and they provided a service. So therefore, the Talmud considers that worthy of compensation. The interesting thing is there was no contract. So there seems to be an implied contract. When someone saves your stuff, they should be rewarded somehow for their efforts. So that's one type of brokerage service where I'm not really interested in this, but you still created a benefit for me, so I compensate you for that. The other thing is that you help to bring together market decisors. Someone's looking to sell, someone's looking to buy. You bring those people together. The earliest example I found, and this is what I found, I can't tell you this is the earliest case, of people being compensated, or at least some of the earliest cases, people being compensated for providing compensation for making marriages, is I found it in the laws of Hanukkah that belong to the Maharil, Rabbi Israel Isserlin, who was a rabbi in the 15th century, in southern Germany, known as Bohemia, which also happened to end up being now it is Hungary. And he talks about that he gets a large stipend of money from using his reputation to bring couples together from across the Jewish world. And he talks about the merit of doing that and how he feels blessed to be able to provide that service for people. Apparently, it was something super meaningful that he was compensated well for it. What's funny is that when the rabbis of the Talmud talk about making matches, they say it's really difficult and it's something even God himself struggles with, of making matches. And it's a tremendous, tremendous mitzvah. But the Talmud never actually talks about it as a service, and certainly not as a brokerage service. So a number of these issues are discussed later on in that sort of time period. You find the earliest discussions of it being in rabbis who were in that time period, such as Rabbeinu Asher, who lived around the 14th century, the Rashba, who lived a little later in the 15th century, and all these things are quoted a few times in and around the Shulchan Aruch. But it's essentially an employment contract. You are asking somebody to either provide you with a service, or someone comes to you and they say, I have an idea, a market idea for you, which in this case is to make a match. So the rabbis at that time period had to help make some decisions about it. So in a similar work, the Maharil in the Trumas edition also talks about when you are owed for being compensated for your services of matchmaking. And he discusses that in the context of making the marriage happen. He says that you're not done with this deal until they all get married. So you're not owed anything. That's what he basically says is the common custom for his time period. But that seems to develop over time and change a little bit. So let's talk a little bit more about the actual brokering of matches. And we'll talk about it in terms of Shadchanim, in terms of matching up men and women to eventually contract to get married. Again, the whole point is this type of brokering is somebody who is not party to the actual items being exchanged. They are simply using their set of people skills to make things happen, and that's an important point. So a shadchan is somebody who is going to find one party and connect them with another party and get them together. Do they need to have a contract with one of those two people before they can go ahead and do their matchmaking services? So that's the main focus of matchmaking, is that you often have to reach out to them to get them to perform that service for you. So there was an interesting letter that I read in the Lakewood Scoop, which is from September, which talks about what we affectionately know as gatekeeping, where it's very difficult to enter into a market where certain people are not able to enter into it unless you go through certain brokers. You can't go ahead and make purchases unless you go through a broker. A similar type of system to this is the brokering of houses in real estate brokerage. Very often, a real estate broker will approach a homeowner, or they will be contacted by the homeowner, and they will contract, and especially in America nowadays, will have a written contract giving them rights to find them a buyer, and then as a result of completing the sale, will be paid a brokerage fee for accomplishing that. So what's interesting is this is also one of the earliest examples of halakha in the Tshuvos HaRosh, and one of the response of the Rosh, of a case of brokering real estate. Now, like, why are we comparing marriages and real estate? Well, because everything is similar and everything's different. But it's important to look at some of the early cases that give us a sense of understanding the ethics of entering into a brokerage contract when we're talking about something that's very personal to us when it comes to making matches for marriages. So when we look at making a match in this case, when you've approached the seller to contract with you to list their property, in a modern setting, they take every opportunity to list your property to get lots of people to look at the possible match. The Chuvas Harosh was asked, what if I broker your property and I find you a buyer, but you don't like the buyer? Okay, so are you owed a fee? So the Rush was asked this question, and he says, well, let's look at the case. You weren't actually asked in this case to do the brokering. I told you my property was for sale, but I didn't contract you to find me a buyer. So as a result, we don't actually have an agreement of employment of any kind. If you bring me somebody and I decide not to contract with them to sale, again, I owe you nothing. So the Rush looks at some other cases outside of his own question to explain that this doesn't mean that brokers aren't owed anything. He says, if you hired somebody and told them to go find you a buyer, you owe them. And he says there's a case in the Talmud where if I find you for a job and I send you on that job, you finish that job and you come back, I no longer need your services, well, I've already entered into an employment contract for you. I sent you on a job. You were reporting something for me. So I owe you whatever I promised to pay you as a result of transferring something from point A to point B. I owe you for that job. Whether or not I needed it afterwards is irrelevant. I have to fulfill that contract. So if I told you to go and sell my house, I didn't tell you anything specific about whom I wanted to sell it to, and there's no other conditions for it. Once I've gone ahead and found you a buyer, and you refuse it, if I've contracted with you to do that, and you say I don't like the buyer, well, okay, you still owe me a fee for finding him. Go find somebody else if you don't like this. And in fact, in many modern contracts, it often says that as long as the buyer is fit and willing to buy, sometimes you can actually see that you'll be owed a brokerage fee in some real estate contracts. It's actually a smart way to protect yourself as a broker, so that way the buyers don't drive you crazy. And it makes sense, because otherwise you could waste your time. Like, I don't like this person, I don't like that person. You can basically say, listen, I brought you, everything about them was right, they had the right financing, they had the money, and everything was good. So if you decide, and they want to move forward, you decide not to move forward, you're still going to owe me a fee because I fulfilled the terms of my contract. Some other jurisdictions may not have a contract written in that way. So in a case of making a match, if someone approached, let's say a father approached a Shadchanim and said, find an appropriate young lady to marry to my son. So he has now made an employment contract with the Shadchan. So in that case, the Shadchan would have to go find an appropriate match for his son, come back to him, and propose the match. Now again, and even in the cases of the Maharil, they sometimes said you had to wait until after the marriage was finished. But in a case where I've contracted you to do that, then as soon as I went and find you the appropriate match, if everything seems to work out, you should be owed a fee for having provided a match. The fact that they don't like each other may actually be irrelevant. You may owe them because you've contracted the Shadchan to go ahead and do this for you. And if you think I'm making this up, I've actually investigated this to see if modern Shadchanim contract like this, and some of them do in the Orthodox world. You have to pay as a person looking for matches, either you or a parent, and you will contract them on your behalf to find you matches, and you pay a fee, and they go through their Rolodex of people, and they go ahead and come back with matches, and they charge you based on, I'm going to provide you X number of matches, I did X amount of research, and you owe me for my time in doing this. And if you've contracted that, then yes, you owe them a fee, even if you, on your end, get nothing out of it. If no one wants to marry you, or no one wants to marry your son, as the case I just gave up. Now, I mentioned gatekeeping a little earlier. Gatekeeping is an interesting problem that creates market inequalities, because it basically does not allow the independent actors to contract with each other. And the best way to kind of see how this would work is there's a wonderful scene in the show, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. I looked up to see where this scene was. It's in season 4, and it's in episode 6. And just to give you an idea about the market inequalities created by Shadchanim, modern Shadchanim, and the process of Shadchanus nowadays, is there's a scene in there where Mrs. Mazel's mother, Rose Weissman, decides she wants to become a matchmaker. And so at some point she has sent a letter from these other matchmakers that meet in Boynton Beach, which is a neighborhood in the Brooklyn borough of New York City. And they invite her in, and they have her for a meal, and they're chatting, and the ones who are there talk about how established they are in their job. And they profess to her that it's important that she understands how difficult the job is, and how protected the information is, and how much they would like for her to either find another place to do her job, or just to stop doing it altogether. Because they were trying to explain to her that it was very, very difficult to perform the art of matchmaking when there's too much competition. And they make it out to be a big deal. They talk about that there were shadchan wars, which they make it sound like it was a huge event that cost many people their whatever it was costing them. It's a quite entertaining scene. Hard to talk about it, but definitely worth a 5-minute watch to kind of get the idea of how difficult it is to contract this thing. Because what can you do for a business that has nothing to sell? So in the case of brokerage, the only way to protect yourself is your contract for a service fee. So the only way that you can control the product in this market is to control who enters it. Can you do that? Can you control the market? So the truth of the matter is that al pi halacha, by the strictest of laws, the Torah does not prohibit anybody from entering a market to contract for their services. It's not prohibited. The Torah prohibits something what's known as hasagas gevul. The Torah prohibits encroaching on someone else's property line. The person who's the nearest neighbor should be able to get there first. However, the rabbis in the Talmud talk about not encroaching on someone else's business as it being unethical to do that. So the interesting thing is that when the Rosh himself was asked about this type of case, he said, I can't restrict you from anything as long as it's not unethical. In fact, I can't even tell you where to live because it would be unethical to restrict you to where to live and where to go and how to tell you how to live your lives. However, in the Talmud, it talks about you have to be sensitive to the people around you when you get into these businesses. So you do have a problem, a rabbinic issue of hasagas gevul, of basically interfering with someone else's property lines if you run certain businesses that are disruptive to your neighbors. I won't get in too much detail about that because it will take us too far away from the ethics of the actual brokering process. But it's important to know that when you have nothing to sell, when you have a control system, it's actually quite legal and proper to do that amongst those actual merchant members. And in later halacha, and especially in the Shulchan Aruch and later on, the local communities were able to control who was allowed to enter the markets, and especially if you came from out of town and wanted to enter a market, they wanted to protect their own business. So these type of things are difficult and they are tough, and so that's why they're especially in Shadchanus, there is a lot of gatekeeping that goes on with the information. However, gatekeeping is important because let's say someone brings you a match in this case, or someone has a buyer for you for your property, or any other brokerage case, or I found these things you sent me to get, I'm bringing them to you. Unless you had an extant contract with them, they could just go around you and contract with that other party. Technically, because you have nothing to sell other than your ability to find these things. So the question then becomes, if I go ahead and go around you, can the buyer skip paying you a fee if I never contracted to pay you a fee? It's one thing to have a contract and have a contract you to do something and you finished it. But if there's no contract, can I just go around you? But one way to protect yourself is to gatekeep. You don't have the ability to do this because I have all the information. So therefore, in order for this to happen, you have to pay me for it. Okay, so that's one way to do it. The problem with gatekeeping, obviously, is it becomes rather, as that episode points out, it becomes rather violent and rather antagonistic. It's not an appropriate way to run a marketplace where you become somebody who basically stands on top of people, making sure that things go your way. It's also very inefficient because it doesn't allow people to make their own decisions. You are not able to go ahead and pick the things that you want. You're at the leisure of people providing you with something. So while potentially verifiable and potentially legal, it becomes somewhat unethical to engage in processes of gatekeeping. However, there are many Achronim, including the Aruch Shulchan, who talk about the fact that if there are local laws or customs that regulate this market, that's okay. What does that mean? That means that if the local market prefers that marriages are contracted through matchmaking, then the gatekeeping that may be going on is exactly what the community wants. And as silly as it may feel, this is how they feel is the best way through their process of legislation. You have to have an actual community body that does this type of thing and presents this type of legislation or custom. Again, it doesn't have to be an actual law that's voted on. It can often just be something introduced, let's say by the rabbi in a drasha, and everybody follows it. That also takes hold. It has the strength of the final law, and one can compel based on that. And in fact, the local custom can also determine that the Shadchanim, the matchmakers themselves, are owed a fee, which was a big change from the times of the Trumas Hadeshin himself, in that he says you have to wait until the marriage is finished for you to get paid. Now they're saying, no, once we've gone ahead and we've written a contract for the parties to go ahead and get married, you can also include in that contract, and in fact, custom demands that you include in that contract the fees owed to the matchmaker. Just because last minute the deal falls apart doesn't mean the matchmaker should be left out, hung out to dry. So a custom like that developed later on. So in those cases, even without having to do any sort of unethical gatekeeping, there's sort of an ethical one where we've set some regulations to help reduce some of the issues surrounding entering and brokering in these marketplaces. That's only if such a thing is quite common. The other ethical problem would be here, when we talk about gatekeeping, is what if you already are working on someone's behalf and someone else wants to jump in? And that's what's known as tortious interference in a contract in American law. And in halacha, it's called ani mahapech becharara, where somebody jumps in on something that has no owner, and a poor person really could have used the harara. In this case, it was a little cookie. He was poor and he's looking for something to eat, and you jump in and you make him take. You don't really take a loss, but he can't get this one little simple thing that didn't belong to anybody. So he really doesn't have rights to it, but it feels awful to do that to another person. So regulations were invented later on, especially in the Ashkenazi world, to protect people who acted maliciously in the marketplace, especially interfering in other people's contracts. And we also find that even modern day cases, like I said, it's an interference. You're just getting in their way. They don't have any rights to it. They're not a party to it, but your behavior is rather atrocious. And so we try to protect actors in the market from these type of behaviors. So yes, it would be perfectly legal to go ahead and regulate the shadchan marketplace, to regulate even other forms of brokerage as well, and to make sure that people are protected in that marketplace. You can define at what point people are paid. You can also define whether or not someone is interfering in the negotiations. And you can also define who is allowed to go ahead and bring these parties together to complete the contract. So we have a lot of these different parts of it that are all working together. There's a tshuva from Reb Moshe in which he's asked a very specific question, which is, what would you do if you have multiple people acting on a broker item, in this case a shidduch, and so they make a match. So, but you have one person who made the introduction, and then another person who's also a matchmaker. They don't necessarily like each other, but there's certain things that they say that make the match go better. And but the truth is that neither one of them had a real employment contract at the beginning. And so he kind of weighs the cases and situations, and he says it's also important to consider that when we talk about somebody providing you a service that you didn't ask for, but that it has a significant benefit to you, that person is al pi din, by virtue of what the Talmud itself says, that person is deserving of compensation. The question is, what is it of value that they have provided? There has to be something. Usually in a contract, there has to be what they always call considerations, right? There has to be something of which they're discussing. So what is it that they've done? So Rav Moshe, echoing some of the thought patterns that have come through the centuries, talks about providing certain social skills that help to get these deals to finish. And that's entirely possible that a person is part of the actual deal itself. The only thing is that you can't attach a price to these individual parts of the service, because my chit-chatting with the buyer and my chit-chatting with the seller, or my chit-chatting with the man and chit-chatting with the woman, eventually they have to have a meeting of the mind. Something that you say or do brings them to that. Of what value is that? So he talks about going and looking at what the common custom is for setting fees for these brokerage terms. And a lot of later Achronim within the past 50 years have talked about expanding this idea of custom to also look at fees to help resolve potential disputes. I made the broker the deal. I did this and I did that, and they come before you and they're complaining. You have a lot of things to consider. Number one, what are you asking for? What thing of value have you lost out on? And what are you trying to get from the other party? So the best thing you can look at is what a normal employment contract would consider, which is, well, they wouldn't be together if I wasn't here saying what I wanted to say and doing what I wanted to do. And so therefore they're looking to be compensated for their time, which makes them similar to a day laborer. You asked me to perform this labor for you, I'm digging holes for you, I'm fixing walls for you, right? And my time is my compensation. So therefore you can look at it like that. How much is a normal person paid for something like that? If you appointed me to fulfill a specific service, I want, this thing, I want you to make a watch. I want you to weave this garment. The amount of time you put into it is immaterial, because that's all rolled into the service price itself. So when you finally get it, the idea is the object has a certain cost attached to it because of the completing of the efforts for you. So if you told me to go do that, and I provided that service for you, then I'm not being compensated for my time, and the contract has been fulfilled. So that is many of the issues that go into examining the process of Shadchanos. So we've been super technical talking about whether or not you get paid for it or not, and we're assuming also that you're good at your job and you find the thing that the other person is looking for, and you have a meeting of the minds. Let's talk about what you can talk about, because that is really the crux of the ethical part of brokering. Again, you have nothing to sell. I want to make that very, very clear. You are not a party to the transaction. You are simply trying to get everybody together. So it makes for a lot of ethical issues and considerations when you're trying to get somebody to engage in business. You are going to have to be wary of what you say, because things that you say could damage other parties as a result of you trying to make certain deals happen. So that's the important this part of this discussion is, now that we've kind of talked about how you are contractually related to the two parties, we're now going to talk about what you may and may not say legally and ethically in order to get these transactions to happen. So a lot of this is basically leaning on the legs of the Chafetz Chaim and what he defines as talking about things that are lit toeles, and what things are considered pertinent and are allowed to help you make your decisions. So let's focus a little bit on the ethics of how to get this contract to go forward without damaging the other party. Okay. So we have to kind of look at the way that information is exchanged. So let's talk about the way we exchange information. Generally speaking, we look at information as something that is provided from one party to another. Okay, and we also talked about how there's a difference between someone who is acting without your consent on your behalf, and we talk about somebody acting on your behalf as a result of being employed by you. And so with those different considerations, we have to look at what are the different relationships between the person who is basically going to decide the end of the deal and the person brokering it. So the person brokering it has to communicate with what's known as to'eles. Okay, it has to be a benefit. So let's talk about the prohibition itself. The prohibition itself is lo selech rachil ba'amecha. Do not go about as a talebearer in your people. And the Rambam classifies this as saying anything damaging or disparaging, even if it's true, that could be harmful to another party, and doing so, even to somebody privately, is a part of the prohibition. And if you go about telling it to a number of people, is a second prohibition. So you violate these things in a couple different ways based on what you're saying. There's no action taking place. I guess we have nothing to sell. All you can do is basically run your mouth to get people to do something. So be very, very careful you don't damage somebody for this purpose. Okay, so let's talk about what you're allowed to say. Okay, you have to be justified in making these statements. Okay, so the main thing is that it has to be something that is for the benefit of the person. Okay, the number one thing is that the Chafetz Chaim himself doesn't really say that this is permitted. He just seems to mention in passing that it is not part of Lashon Hara. Okay, so you are allowed to go ahead and say things that are part of the statement, as long as they are true. Okay, so basically, as long as you're not trying to damage somebody and you're not trying to talebear, that would seem to say that a lot of information is okay. But if you're saying things that are negative, you're going to be having a problem. So let's say you want to talk about a match. There are two types of Lashon Hara. So and for those who would like to go more into this, we are giving a shiur regularly on YouTube on Shmiras HaLashon. We're talking about it right now and learning about it. So if you like to subscribe to the channel, now's a great time to hit that subscribe button and share with your friends. We've already gone through 11 chapters of Shmiras HaLashon, so we're talking all about these issues right now together. So, you are not allowed to speak negatively, is the number one part about it. And you can't cause any type of harm to someone, even if it's not derogatory. So there is derogatory stuff, there's negative stuff, and there's also saying things that, So the example that they give here in the Arucha book is, Ruvain is somewhat of an average guy. Okay, so why is that a problem to say that of Lashon Hara? Well, maybe Ruvain has a furniture business, and they want to hire him to move the furniture, and you say, he's of average strength. So he's going to drop my furniture? So that in that case, that could cause him a loss, and you should have said nothing, unless you know for a fact he's actually been causing a loss. So the damages have to be something that is very, very obvious. And you have to say things that could cause somebody loss immediately. So if you say that he's not strong enough to move furniture and his job is to sell furniture and move furniture, well, that's a bad thing. So to say something about that in the case of making matches would be terrible. It would be extremely harmful. So there are 5 conditions necessary to permit sharing of information that is potentially negative but it's for the benefit of the listener. Okay? Again, because there's also mitzvahs, and Chafetz Chaim goes through a number of these, a number of mitzvahs that lo tamor al dam rayacha, and so on and so forth, that you are, supposed to not stand by while someone suffers damage, even to their property. You also have the idea that no one has to stand by and watch their stuff be damaged, because people are, there's basically the idea that people aren't allowed to destroy your stuff or be destructive, so you can act on your own behalf to protect your things. So looking at some of those, we have to say, this has to be good. And there's a number of situations to which could apply. If you're a manager managing staff, you have to keep tabs on whether or not they're performing well or not. So there has to be permitted ways in which people can keep tabs about the performance of employees. There has to be ways in which people can communicate, permitted ways in which people can communicate that things are not going well. So you can't just sort of say everything that someone gets some type of, or traumatized by a statement, is prohibited to say. The fact that you don't like hearing certain things, that doesn't mean it's prohibited. We also have an obligation to give teichacha, to give reproof, to make sure people do the good things. We're supposed to tell people how to be better people. So negative information isn't always prohibited information. So here's how we're allowed to exchange information that is potentially negative, but it's for the benefit of the person hearing it, especially in the case of where you're brokering, where all you have to sell are your social skills. All right. Number one is the potential for harm is real and unjustifiable. Again, this is in these are the words from the Yerucha book. I love how they put it together over here. So the harm that the speaker is trying to protect the listener from would be unjustified if it came to pass. So it's a real, clear, and present harm. There is something that will definitely hurt you somehow. Okay, number two is the information is shared accurately without exaggeration. So you cannot editorialize. If you say a person gets angry, you can say that this person gets angry with this amount of frequency. It must be a fact. You must state a fact. You can't say they get angry all the time. That's an exaggeration. They're not angry all the time. They're not angry right now. On the door. That's false. You've now spoken lashon hara. Right? When do they get angry? What situations are there problems? Do they get frustrated while working? Do they have difficulty problem solving? Those are to'elas. Number three, the speaker is relaying the information for the benefit of the listener and not out of enmity towards the person about whom he is speaking. The speaker must ensure that relaying the information will likely have the desired effect of protecting the listener from harm. So, you're doing it to tell the other party that this person will be bad for you, and they are able to point to specific reasons why that is the case. So if I tell somebody it's better not to send your kids to that school, or you shouldn't do business with that guy, I can't just say that. That would be lashon hara. I say you shouldn't send your kids to that school because I believe that your kid needs XYZ for their learning, and this school does not look out for those type of special needs or those type of education techniques. You can point it out because it's a fact. Same thing too. You shouldn't go to do business in that place. If you say don't do business with him because he's going to charge you more than I'm going to charge you, that's a fact, right? Or he's going to charge you more than the other guy's going to charge you, that's a fact. Okay. Now there's an issue about are you allowed to do that, if that's appropriate to do, if you're going to cause a loss to that guy where he would have certainly bought from the first place and you interfered in that contract. So it's not so simple. You have to be very careful with what you're saying, and a lot of posts can kind of go into it. Is he going to overcharge you by more than 25%? Is he trying to get people to spend money wantonly? There's a lot in there. It's not just so simple. So this is a really difficult part about it. Number four is there's no other way of protecting the listener. If I don't share this information with you, you're going to not be happy. I need to protect you. And the last one is nothing unjust will happen to the subject, meaning the person about whom you're speaking, and he will not be harmed in a way that he doesn't deserve according to halakha. So that's the thing, is that there should be that type of case. So again, these are difficult. So in the cases, let's talk about this in the case of making matches, because it becomes difficult. So al pi halakha, you can actually ask a lot of questions that are recorded in the Talmud that are not lashon hara. You can ask people how they look. You can ask people, if they think that they have any physical deformities. You can ask people if they have anything that it would be apparent on their person that would be something undesirable or something that you personally would have difficulty with. And you need to couch it in that sense. If you say it in a derogatory way, it would be a problem, right? You say, "Oh, you don't want to date them; they're fat," right? Who made you decide that all fat people are unattractive? Maybe this person likes fat people, right? So you would have to only answer a question if you were asked directly: Are they skinny? Are they fat? And that becomes sort of a binary thing, like that. So you can say, "I don't know. I can't really define it," and then you get to decide about pictures and so on and so forth. That would be one way to describe it. Are they missing a hand? Are they missing a finger? Are they missing this? Sometimes you volunteer the information, but again, as we learned, if it looks like you're going to damage the other party, the person who is doing the searching, let's say the guy has hired you to be a matchmaker, to volunteer information that does them no damage and sees them no benefit, to say things like they're missing a finger, they're having this, they have burn marks, from an injury, unless they are requesting that information from you, that shouldn't be shared. Things that can be shared would be things that would be behaviorally problematic. So if you know for a fact that there are certain diagnoses with which they have been afflicted, that information can be shared. But more often what happens is they just, instead of being someone who's party to that information, they generally just recommend that a match, if they decide that they like the match, they should go ahead and do testing on their own to see what the genetic testing might look like. Also, if they have any type of mental illness and so on, it's debatable as to whether or not you can share because it's not an obvious defect, but it's something that someone should know about if they are suffering from other types of mental illness, such as bipolar disorder, autism, or anything that could be problematic. They should be aware about, because it can be difficult to live with people who have certain conditions. So other things that may not be noticeable is if they have early stages of, say, Parkinson's or things like that. But if there are certain physical issues with which they could struggle with, for example, they need to reveal or they need to be aware of, and things that if aren't discussed could actually ruin a marriage contract altogether if they don't realize that the job that they deal with makes them have a foul smell. This is one of the oldest problems in the Talmud. If they didn't tell you at first that they work in a tannery and they smell like the tanning materials, is one of the examples. Those are cases where one of the parties who are going to be contracting here could suffer real damages. It becomes impossible to share the same house with them. So I say the word sleep because the other case that I want to mention is there's a case in the Ramah, and it talks about what if that is actually an interesting case. What if the parties were already married? They're looking for grounds for divorce, and the wife is looking for grounds for divorce, and she wants to seek divorce from the court. And so, can she approach based on the fact that her partner consistently wets the bed, and they share a bed? And so the Ramah, the Ramosh Israelis, says that this is not enough to compel divorce because there are ways to get around that. However, he says that the parties, if they can't resolve it, should probably think of other arrangements, but it's not absolute grounds. So can you share that ahead of time? Yes, that's something that is potentially damaging to the person, but it's not absolutely intolerable, but it may be something that they should know about before they get into it. So if they have some type of issue like this, this is an obvious physical issue that can affect them that other people could know about. And so this would be pertinent information to share. And so I'm not going to elaborate much more on that, but just to give you a few examples of this. Let's talk about the possible injuries that can occur and how to protect yourselves in situations. And we're going to really talk about the sort of the bare bones ethics of brokering and the Shadchanim business in and of itself. So there is an issue with gatekeeping. One is not allowed to prohibit people from contracting, like we said. So if you have a business whereby you want someone to find you matches, it doesn't matter whether you're male or female, the shadchan can't actually restrict you from seeing other people. It's hard to restrict you using contracts that prohibit you from entering the markets or don't allow you to disclose certain information, or that you can't talk about it with other people. These contracts are really difficult, and they would also require you to do things like that would basically have the same halachic ramifications of taking an oath not to speak about this and not to talk about that, not to engage in this, and it's really you start to get us on a slippery slope of oaths and stuff like that from the Torah, which we really frown upon. So those type of things really are inappropriate, and they're not a healthy way to build and contract business. So any shadchan who wants you to basically sit back, relax, and pay them their fees, while they do that, it's somewhat unethical, and especially if a person is dissatisfied, it's hard to get out of that contract, because in some ways they've basically consented to an oath, and you'd have to either end the time period, have to end for that oath, or you would have to have it annulled. Otherwise, you'd constantly be breaking it if you were tired of being gate kept, for lack of a better term. It's important to also follow local laws and customs when it comes to entering this, which means you also have to follow the laws of Lashon Hara. And if you do have a bad match, you're not allowed to go and say, I'm going to tattle on you to everybody. I actually had a case like this, and I said, the fact that you had a bad experience with them does not allow you to go and badmouth them to others. In fact, it probably was a good idea for them not to match with you, since that behavior is prohibited. An appropriate match would also mean somebody who's also willing to follow laws of the Torah, like not being a talebearer. So a lo selech rachil, and if you're saying that you were mad about a match and how you experienced it on the phone, to give feedback to the matchmaker is fine. You can say, I had a bad experience on the phone, this is what happened, facts. And then they can weigh the two sides of it. Why was it so bad on the phone? Oh, it was we had a tough time communicating, and I just didn't want to deal with it anymore. Okay? Yeah, that could have been just as simple as that. They weren't, even if they were rude to you on the phone or you took it bad, doesn't mean that they're a bad person. It means that they were kind of done with the conversation and expressed it to you and didn't want to engage any further. So to go about and speak about them outside of this situation and outside of your shadchanis would violate the conditions of toelas. You were exhibiting enmity to the other party, and you would therefore violate Lashon Hara laws or Rechilas laws. It's also important that shadchanim are honest and upfront about what they do and how they contract. A professional one will generally tell you what to expect. Sometimes they'll have a very limited representation. They'll look at their list now, they'll have a match for you, and never hear from them again unless you nudge them. And that's something that should be sort of expressed initially. It becomes very frustrating because everyone wants to give you a 30-minute interview, and these things are a one-time free service. It's a lot of time. So if they're not going to look for more than once, then you could say certain things. You basically say, I'll do this if I get X number of matches. I'll put my time and effort into it. Other things here too is, for example, in relation to other brokerage services, when you want somebody to do a job for you, be very clear and upfront about your intentions, about what you're looking for, and don't leave any contract inexplicit. It's not good for you. It's not good for them, because it doesn't increase peace in the world. And one of the things that we always try to find is that people should be more peaceful with each other. So being clear about what you want and being upfront about it is very, very important. It's very ethical to say what it is you're looking for from a service. And the other party needs to be very clear about what they're trying to offer. This way you actually have a meeting of the minds. If you're going to walk into it, let's say as a matchmaker, and say, this is what you deserve, you should never be hired. You are here to provide a service. Unless you're a doctor, there's no reason why you should. I actually had a case where somebody put doctor in front of their name, and they wanted to be a matchmaker. And after talking to them, I realized I said, you put yourself a doctor, but you're not a social scientist. You don't need psychology. I that you have a business degree as a doctorate. I said, well, why are you calling yourself, why are you representing yourself as a doctor? It's interesting, you're a doctor, but you're not a professor. You're providing a service outside of, you're not a doctor of anything. It's misleading. So those things are unethical. And again, you're playing a little bit with fire in some of these cases. So other ethical considerations to put into these things are people entering into the contract and the people brokering it very, very clear about what you want. In a real estate brokerage contract, it's very clear. I'm going to represent you to sell your house, and therefore I expect compensation at this time for providing this service. And like I mentioned earlier, if you want compensation for finding a buyer, say it in your contract. If you're mad they don't buy it with that buyer, you should have been clear about that at the beginning. And you want them to find you the appropriate match. If they think it's a good match and you drop the ball, right, because of stuff that you have to deal with, if they want to get compensated for it, I want to be clear about it, and don't get mad at them when they want compensation for it, because they're providing a service. And again, you'll say in the contract, are you ask them to do something for you for a time period? They'll get paid like a day laborer, right? I'm going to spend 7 days going through matches, come back with matches for you, and you will pay me this amount. Clear, unambiguous. If it is ambiguous, you are going to have to wait for people to decide things through local custom, and good luck with that. You have to go to Beis Din. The Beis Din will be the arbiter of what's a local custom and what's not. And you maybe can start pointing to laws, local laws in your jurisdiction, or things you've seen. Or as one person likes to put it, there, if you get two Talmudic Chachamim, everyone's pulling the books off the shelves, and the Rav has to sit and decide between all this nonsense. Anyway, the main thing is to follow paths that are peaceful and be very clear about it. Perhaps the Doctor of Business Administration felt that such a credential would relate to the paid services being offered, ethically trained, perhaps. Maybe. That would have been, if they were clear, and that's actually part of the problem, is that if you are representing yourself as something, you need to be clear about they were unclear about what their credentials were in. So often when people present themselves as doctors of something, as a doctor of something, they need to be very, very clear about it. So that was the interesting thing about it. I'm not being specific about it, because I know in case someone would think about the case that it was. If it was exactly as you say, if it was a person who had, like an MBA could very well go ahead and broker any type of deal, as long as they're good at writing contracts. A lawyer go ahead and be a good matchmaker, because why? They're very good at writing contracts, and they'll stipulate these things. Let's wrap up the class now, just to review everything we've talked about, and I'll stay for a minute or two to answer some questions. So we talked about that Shadchanis is an old profession, and brokering also an old profession. However, it's not so explicit in the Talmud. We're talking about you basically helping out two parties to contract with each other, and that it functions like an employment contract. So you have to have some idea of what kind of employment you are seeking and how you would like to be compensated. You also, as the broker, or as the shadchan in this case, need to be very clear about what you're looking for, what type of compensation you expect, and you should make sure that you kind of contract with both parties to make sure that they're very clear about it. There do need to be a number of ethical considerations. You need to follow all halacha. You need to not interfere with other people's ability to contract. You need to make sure that you are specific about the job that you are performing. You need to make sure that since your whole job is to simply talk about another product, you are very careful about what you say to only deliver the facts about it and why you think it's a good contract to enter into with the other party. Again, you've got nothing to sell when you're brokering. It's just how well you run your mouth and how well you couch things and how well you deliver them. And so therefore you want to avoid the appearance of doing things that are either violate halakha or just are purely unethical. And the best way to do that is to make sure that you are very, very clear about your intentions. State your contract at the outset, talk to the initial party, avoid gatekeeping wherever possible, but you must follow local and established custom and regulations. And you must also enter this type of situation always looking to do shalom. It always must be peaceful. Always must be peaceful. So let's go ahead and open up the virtual floor to any questions. that may be available. Wait a few seconds over here if you have something to type up. If not, you can always reach me via the YouTube page. Matchmaking is truly a skill with inherent natural gifts. Such a person should not be shut out from the marketplace, such as teachers, rabbis, etc. They need to be allowed to go ahead and enter. Yes, they really do. They really do. They need to be allowed to offer themselves. So, however, that doesn't mean that it can't be regulated. So the point is that all of these different types of professions could potentially be regulated. Al pi halakha. I was just bringing that up in case someone was wondering about if it could be, but it would be unethical to break into a marketplace that's being regulated. If you don't like it, you need to go to another place. Or the internet is a great way to get out of having other problems. So potentially, because you're not necessarily, you're bound by a different set of rules, perhaps. Any other questions? Thank you very much for attending our class. Again, we would appreciate your support, both of our mission here with the Beis Din Tzedek of Washington, D.C., and also with your support of programs like Your Rucha, the Beis Havad in Lakewood, for promoting Kosher Mishpat and help people live fuller and more ethical lives through Torah and Ma'asim Tovim. Thank you everyone for joining. The shir will be posted and up for review, and I will potentially look at adding a few sources here or there. If you are interested, if you join Your Rucha, you can definitely look at a lot of the source material that was used and prepared for this year as a result of their commitments and their Harbatzis Torah. Thank you everyone for coming out, and we'll see you next time.